is Unit 4, Part 4 of the nervous systems. We continue talking more and more about the nervous system. Today we're going to talk about the ideas of sensation and perception. Sensation is a term that refers to an action potential that has reached the brain and that you caused by some sort of external stimulus or like one of your five senses. So when you see an image, that sensation has reached your brain. Now, perception is how that information is received. And so, give you an example. Again, you see an image, that is the light that you are sensing. Your brain is receiving that information, but it is processing it and perceives it as an image. It's just light that's causing your nerve to actually work, but it's an image that your brain perceives it as. Or when you smell something, it's a chemical that is causing the sensory endings in your nose to work and send that message to the brain, but your brain perceives it as an odor. And so that difference between sensation and perception is the difference between the physical workings of the nervous cell and how your brain perceives that. And so perception can be a wide variety of things, whereas sensation is fairly straightforward. So what we're going to look at now is we're going to look at the way that this occurs. So it's very similar to what we've talked about before. You have to have a particular amount of input for that to cause your nervous system to fire. Our nervous system, for instance, doesn't work with infrared light. We can't sense infrared light, so we don't perceive it at all. And so it doesn't cause our nervous system to do an action potential. When a sound is really quiet, we can't hear it. Or some odors you can't smell. They're just completely foreign to you. Like a dog can smell lots of things that we can't smell. So you still have the idea of the threshold having to be reached, the action potential happening. And with sensation, there's also the idea of, if you've been in a room too long and the room smells bad or whatever, eventually you get used to the smell. Well, that's because your brain has basically said, okay, I get it now. I don't need to keep receiving that information. And so continuous stimuli with that information can cause your brain to be adapted to that particular sensation. So let's look at a couple of the types of receptors. There are interoreceptors, and exteroreceptors. Pretty straightforward what they are. These are internal receptors. This is received by the brain and you never know that it's being received, like maybe your body temperature has gone up or you are hungry or some kind of receptor like that. Whereas an exteroreceptor, these are external. These are ones that receive external information, like, well, here's a picture, a cross-section of some skin, and look at the different receptors that are found on the skin: heat, pain, and light. Light touch, not light. And so these receptors have names. We're going to give them some more official looking names. There are the external ones. There are mechanoreceptors. There are nociceptors, thermoreceptors, chemoreceptors, and electromagnetic receptors. Now, big words for little things. Mechanoreceptors has to do with like physical, like pressure or touch or vibration. Nociceptors are pain. These are found everywhere in the body, not just external. They're found everywhere except for the brain, actually. Thermoreceptors, this is heat and cold. chemo, this is chemicals, this is like your taste buds and your smell. And electromagnetic, this is light, so this is would be in your eyes. So we're going to look at some of the specifics now of the sensory organs. First, the ear. The ear senses vibrations. So anything you hear, the energy that is getting to your ear is the energy of moving air, is vibrations. And this causes several things to occur. So the vibrations come into your ear canal and they cause your eardrum or your tympanic membrane to vibrate. That causes these tiny little bones. There's 3 tiny bones inside your ear, and that causes them to all rattle. And then they rattle against this area here called the oval window. Not important. The the oval window connects directly to this organ, the cochlea, and that's where I want to spend most of my time talking. The cochlea is the most important organ of the hearing sensation, because without it you can't hear. I mean, you can't hear without an eardrum or these little bones either. But the cochlea is what is directly interfacing with the brain. And so how does that work? Well, this is the inside of the cochlea, and there's a lot here, as you can see, but there's a main idea that I want you to get out of this. Inside the cochlea, so here's the little bone here, and here's that oval window, and when that rattles, that causes all this fluid in here to have ripples, and those ripples can be sensed. And there's big ripples and small ripples, and the different kinds of ripples represent different kinds of sound. And I mean, it's as infinite as your ability to hear many different kinds of sound are. And as those ripples are moving, let's go a little bit deeper here. We're going to basically look at a cross section of like this area right here. Here's that cross section. Inside there, zoomed way in, here's zoomed way in, there are these tiny hair cells, and those ripples cause those hair cells to bend, like literally physically bend. And that bending is a transfer of energy, right? The vibration causes those to bend, and when they bend, it causes those cells to depolarize. Depolarization leads to action potential, nerve impulse goes to the brain perceives that as sound. And so that's the big idea here with any sensation that we're going to talk about, is when there is that energy transfer, in this case it's vibration to electricity, it's going to cause a depolarization of that cell, and then that's going to send that impulse to the brain. Here's the auditory nerve, has a direct pathway to the brain. Brain perceives that as a sound, and so forth. All right, and so it's these tiny little hair cells that are causing that to work. Not only is your ear associated with hearing, but it is also associated with balance. Here's a picture of your cochlea again. On the cochlea are these 3 tubes, all pointed in different directions, sideways, up and down, and diagonal. And they are called the semicircular canals. They are directly uh, over your sense of balance. They tell you when you're standing and when you're laying down. Not that you don't already know that, but if you can imagine falling through the air, like if you've ever jumped off a diving board or something like that, it's harder to get your sense of right side up. But when you fall into the water, all of a sudden gravity is acting on you. Well, what does that mean? How do you know? The reason that you know is because these semicircular canals have been attuned to be able to tell you, okay, you're now standing, you're now laying down, whatever, and this is how you fix that. And so there are a couple of instances that we have gotten ourselves into as humans that trick these canals. For instance, flying. Airline pilots are taught to not trust their senses, because when they look out the window, they just see blue. Well, you can see blue if you're upside down and sideways in an airplane. And so you need to be able to trust the instruments on the airplane panel, because they teach you which way is right side up, for instance, which is a good thing if you're in an airplane. And then there's another disorder called vertigo, where the semicircular canals are sending wrong information to the brain, and you don't know whether or not you're standing or sitting. And there's this weird balance issue. People feel dizzy all the time, and that's why that is. So let's move on to taste and smell. They're very closely linked together, taste and smell. Here's just a picture of a taste bud. These are sugar molecules. Sugar molecules are chemicals. Those chemicals cause the uh, neurons in the taste bud to depolarize, and then the brain perceives that as sweet. So salty or sour, there's all these different flavors that we can taste, and it's because the taste buds perceive those chemicals as different things. The nose is very similar. You have chemicals that reach these little receptors in the nose, these neurons. This is the bone here. So right underneath your nasal cavity or right above it is the brain. So it's pretty close to the outside world. And it receives those chemicals, causes a depolarization, and then you perceive those chemicals as a particular odor. These two are very closely related, taste and smell. They Taste is actually around 80% smell. So if you can't smell a thing, it's harder to taste it. And things that smell bad, it's hard for us to believe that they'll taste good. And that's because those two things are so closely linked. So let's look at some other organisms' stimulus detection structures. One of those is in fish called the lateral line. The lateral line is like ears that run along the side of the fish's body, and they can detect vibrations, they can detect chemicals in the water. Another thing that's found in some organisms is called a statocyst. This is found in cnidarians like jellyfish and some other organisms as well. The statocysts detect gravity, very similar to your own semicircular canals. Here's a frog. Of course, you all recognize a frog. Behind its eye is this big circular area called the tympanum, and it sounds similar to your own tympanic membrane. This is its eardrum on the outside of its body. It uses this for hearing. Insects have tiny hairs all over their body. It's not to keep them warm like mammals, but these tiny hairs can detect chemicals for taste. They can detect air currents. They can help them to sense their surroundings very well.